Lila Harper had always been drawn to the allure of ancient mysteries. As a promising young archaeologist, she had spent years studying civilizations lost to time, driven by the dream of discovering something extraordinary. And now, standing in the heart of a forgotten desert, she was about to make her greatest discovery yet. The dig site was nestled in the shadow of crumbling stone pillars, remnants of a civilization no one had ever been able to identify. Lila had been called in as part of a small team of specialists, all of them eager to unearth whatever secrets lay buried beneath the sand. The air was thick with the heat of the sun and the anticipation of the unknown. On the third day, something strange happened. While excavating in one of the deeper trenches, Lila's trowel hit something hard and metallic beneath the dust. Her heartbeat quickened. As she carefully brushed away the layers of dirt, she uncovered an intricate box made of obsidian, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer under the sunlight. It was far older than anything they had encountered before, and a profound sense of unease settled over her. "Lila, what did you find?" Her colleague, David, called from nearby. "I'm not sure," she replied, her voice soft, almost reverent. "It looks like some kind of artifact, but it's different." The moment she touched the box, a jolt of coldness shot through her fingers, making her pull back in surprise. She looked around, half expecting the others to have felt it too, but they remained oblivious, caught up in their own work. The box felt unnaturally cold, as if it were not of this world. Against her better judgment, Lila reached for it again. As her hands closed around the box, the air around her seemed to grow heavier, the temperature dropping sharply despite the desert heat. A low hum began to resonate from within the box, so faint that she wondered if she was imagining it. Lila's breath caught in her throat, but curiosity drove her forward. With trembling hands, she pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in a bed of ancient silk, lay a small, stone amulet. It was shaped like an eye, its pupil carved from a dark, gleaming crystal. The instant she saw it, Lila felt a surge of dread, as if she had just unearthed something that had never meant to be found. Without thinking, she picked up the amulet, feeling its weight settle into her palm. As she did, the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. The sensation was so subtle she wondered if it was just her nerves. But then it happened again, more violently this time. "Lila, look out!" David shouted, rushing toward her just as the earth cracked beneath her. Before she could react, the ground gave way, sending her plummeting into the darkness below. She landed hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, all she could do was lie there, gasping for breath, her mind spinning. The amulet was still clutched in her hand, its cold surface biting into her skin. "Lila, are you okay?" David's voice echoed from above, but it sounded distant, muffled by the weight of the earth between them. "I'm fine," she croaked, struggling to sit up. Her head throbbed, and a dull ache radiated through her body. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized she had fallen into a hidden chamber, a tomb, perhaps, or a sacred chamber that had been sealed for centuries. The walls were lined with strange symbols, similar to those etched on the box, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. In the center of the chamber, barely visible through the dust, stood a towering stone statue of a cloaked figure. Its eyes, hollow and empty, seemed to stare directly at her, filling her with an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the amulet in her hand grew warm, pulsing with a life of its own. Lila's breath hitched in her throat. She tried to drop it, but her fingers wouldn't respond. The amulet seemed fused to her skin, its cold tendrils snaking through her veins. A sharp whisper cut through the silence, an ancient voice murmuring words she couldn't understand. And then, the darkness shifted. Something unseen moved in the shadows, something vast and malevolent. A deep, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the chamber, and Lila felt a presence, a terrible, ancient presence, stirring from its slumber. The curse had awakened. Lila's heart raced as she scrambled to her feet, her gaze darting around the dark chamber. The ground still trembled beneath her, as if the earth itself was reacting to the curse that had just been unleashed. Dust and small stones tumbled from the ceiling, and the walls seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. The amulet in her hand pulsed in rhythm with the tremors, as if it was alive. Its warmth seeped into her skin, spreading up her arm like a fever. Panic clawed at her mind, but the same unshakable force that had drawn her to the relic now held her in its thrall. "Lila, Lila, are you okay?" David's voice was more insistent now, but it felt miles away. She tried to shout back, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes were locked on the statue in the center of the chamber. It loomed over her, towering and menacing, its shadow stretching across the chamber like a predator waiting to strike. The growling noise grew louder, reverberating through her bones. Then, to her horror, the statue moved. At first, it was a subtle shift, a slight twitch of its head. But then, the stone figure began to unfurl, its massive limbs creaking as though they had been stiff from centuries of stillness. Its hollow eyes turned toward her, glowing faintly with an inner light. Lila took a step back, her legs shaking, but her body felt frozen in place. The air around her thickened, becoming oppressive, and with every breath, it felt like she was inhaling the weight of centuries of dust and death. The ancient voice whispered again, louder this time. It was speaking directly to her, in a language she couldn't understand but felt deep in her bones. The words seemed to bypass her ears and echo inside her skull, filling her mind with images of fire, destruction, and the fall of an empire. Suddenly, the chamber shifted again, and a massive gust of wind tore through the room, despite being deep underground. The gust extinguished her flashlight, plunging her into near-complete darkness. Only the faint glow from the statue's eyes and the cursed amulet lit the space around her. Lila gasped, backing away toward the wall, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to get out now. The amulet, however, had other plans. The warmth spreading through her arm intensified, becoming unbearably hot. She gritted her teeth against the pain as the heat surged up her neck and into her head. Her vision blurred for a moment, and she stumbled, nearly collapsing. But then, the whispers stopped. The pulsing from the amulet ceased. Silence settled over the chamber like a thick shroud. It was so sudden and so complete that it felt as though the world itself had been muted. Lila blinked, her breathing heavy, trying to make sense of what had just happened. A voice, calm and cold, cut through the silence. This one was not a whisper but clear and commanding, speaking in the same ancient language. The words twisted her insides with a dreadful certainty. Lila's legs gave out, and she fell to her knees. Her eyes, now drawn against her will, returned to the statue. It was no longer a statue. It was a figure of flesh and bone, cloaked in tattered robes, with skin like cracked marble and eyes that gleamed with ancient power. The growling had stopped, replaced by a silence far more terrifying. The figure took a step forward. "Lila." The voice hissed her name, though it was not David calling from above. It was the thing standing before her, its voice rasping through her mind like the scraping of stone. It knew her name. It had always known her name. The amulet in her hand seemed to tighten, as if it were wrapping itself around her bones. She looked down in horror and saw that the veins in her arm had turned black, like ink spreading through water. Panic surged through her chest, but she couldn't scream. She couldn't move. The figure took another step toward her, its face hidden beneath the shadow of its hood, but Lila could feel its gaze boring into her soul. "You have awakened me," it said, its voice reverberating with a terrible power. "You are now bound to the curse." "No," Lila whispered, shaking her head, tears stinging her eyes. "I didn't mean to. I didn't. You didn't have to." The figure loomed over her now, its hand extending toward the amulet. "It was always meant to be found. You are simply the vessel." Lila's mind raced. She could feel the dark energy pulsing through her, corrupting her from the inside. She had to do something, anything, to stop it. With a surge of adrenaline, she tore the amulet from her neck and hurled it across the chamber. It struck the stone floor with a loud crack, but instead of shattering, it bounced and rolled, coming to rest at the feet of the figure. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the figure let out a low, guttural laugh, a sound so cold and malevolent it made Lila's blood run cold. "The curse is not so easily cast aside," it said, bending down to pick up the amulet. As it held the artifact aloft, the chamber trembled again, and Lila's body seized with pain. It felt as though her very soul was being pulled toward the amulet, as though the thing in the statue was trying to drag her into it. Suddenly, the ground began to shake violently. Stones fell from the ceiling, and the walls cracked. Lila heard David's frantic shouts from above, but she could barely focus. The figure, amulet in hand, began to dissolve into shadow, melting into the darkness of the chamber. But before it disappeared completely, it spoke once more. "Run if you can, mortal. The curse has already taken root. You belong to me now." The figure vanished, and Lila collapsed to the ground as the shaking subsided. Above her, a faint light shone from the opening where she had fallen. But deep inside her, she knew. The terror had only just begun. Lila scrambled to her feet, her legs weak and trembling as she glanced around the crumbling chamber. The statue was gone, but the oppressive sense of dread remained, hanging in the air like a thick fog. The amulet's grip on her seemed to have faded, but the dark veins creeping up her arm were a stark reminder that she wasn't free. She wasn't safe. Above, David was still calling her name. His voice was tinged with panic, but it grounded her for a moment. She had to get out of here, out of the suffocating depths of this tomb. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she looked for a way back to the surface. The opening she had fallen through wasn't far, but it felt impossibly distant. Mustering what strength she had left, Lila stumbled toward the light. She clawed at the rough walls, forcing herself to climb, the ground beneath her still trembling with a faint, unnatural pulse. Every movement sent waves of pain through her body, but she pushed through it, her desperation outweighing the agony. When she finally reached the top, David's hand shot out, grabbing her arm and hauling her out of the pit. She collapsed on the ground, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe. The midday sun beat down on her, but its warmth felt foreign, almost mocking in contrast to the cold horror she had just escaped. "Lila, what the hell happened down there?" David asked, his eyes wide with concern. "One minute you're digging, the next the ground opens up and you disappear." "I don't know." Lila cut him off, her voice hoarse. Something ancient." She couldn't finish. How could she explain what had happened? The statue, the voice, the curse? It sounded like madness, but the dark veins crawling up her arm told her it was terrifyingly real. David's eyes flicked to her arm, and his face paled. "Lila, your hand." She looked down and swallowed hard. The black tendrils had spread even further, snaking up toward her shoulder. It wasn't just a visual distortion. She could feel it. Something dark and malevolent crawling beneath her skin. "I need help," Lila whispered, panic rising again. I think I'm cursed." David didn't hesitate. "We're getting you out of here. Now." The two of them hurried back to the main camp, the rest of the excavation team oblivious to the nightmare unfolding beneath their feet. Lila's mind raced as they packed up, her thoughts a blur of terror and confusion. Whatever had happened down in that tomb, it wasn't over. She could feel the darkness clinging to her, seeping deeper into her soul with every passing minute. By the time they reached the base camp, the sky had begun to darken, casting long shadows over the barren desert landscape. The other team members were preparing for the evening, unaware of the danger lurking beneath the surface. But Lila couldn't stay here. She needed answers. She needed to understand what had cursed her, and more importantly, how to break free. That night, as the desert winds howled outside her tent, Lila lay awake, her heart pounding in her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure from the chamber. The hollow eyes, the stone-like skin, the amulet gleaming in its hands. The voice whispered to her still, distant and faint, but growing louder with each hour. "You belong to me now," it repeated over and over in her mind, like a dark mantra. Sleep was impossible. The shadows in her tent seemed to move of their own accord, shifting and twisting, always on the edge of her vision. At first, she thought it was exhaustion playing tricks on her mind, but soon the shapes took form. Indistinct, shadowy figures that stood at the edges of her sight, watching. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, pinpricks of malevolent light. She shot upright, her heart slamming in her chest. Sweat dripped down her brow, and her skin felt clammy, cold. She wasn't imagining it. The figures were there, watching, waiting. A low whisper echoed from somewhere in the room. She spun around, her eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. "David," she called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of the wind outside. Suddenly, a gust of cold air swept through the tent, despite all the flaps being tightly secured. The temperature plummeted, and the figures in the corners moved closer, their forms growing clearer. They weren't just shadows, they had substance. They were real. Lila's breath hitched as one of them reached out toward her. Its hand was skeletal, its skin like decayed parchment stretched over bone. She tried to scream, but no sound came. The figure's hollow eyes locked onto hers, and its hand hovered inches from her face, cold and icy, sending a sharp chill through her bones. "You are mine now," the voice hissed, louder this time, filling the tent with its terrible presence. "You cannot run from what you have awakened." The figure's fingers brushed her cheek, and an icy burn seared through her skin. Lila recoiled, falling back against the ground, her heart hammering wildly. The shadows closed in around her, the air growing thick with their presence. In the distance, she heard David's voice calling her name, but it was drowned out by the rising chorus of whispers, the same ancient language she had heard in the chamber. The words wrapped around her like a noose, tightening, suffocating her. She clutched her head, trying to block them out, but they only grew louder, more insistent. The amulet's curse had taken hold. The darkness was alive, and it wanted her. Just as she thought she might be lost to the shadows, David burst into the tent, a flashlight cutting through the blackness. The shadows recoiled, hissing as the light hit them, dissolving into the corners once more. "Lila, what's going on?" David rushed to her side, his face pale and filled with fear. "I heard you screaming." "I didn't scream," Lila gasped, her voice barely a whisper. She could hardly catch her breath, her body trembling with cold and fear. "I couldn't." David helped her sit up, his eyes scanning the empty tent. "I don't know what's happening to you, but we need to get you out of here. This place isn't safe." Lila nodded, barely able to speak. She glanced at her arm. The dark veins had spread even further, creeping up her neck now. The curse was advancing, and time was running out. As they prepared to leave the dig site, Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her from the shadows. The darkness wasn't gone. It had simply retreated, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Whatever had been awakened in that chamber, it wasn't going to stop until it claimed her completely. The night outside was pitch black, and the desert winds howled like voices in the distance, carrying with them the whispers of an ancient evil. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and confusion as Lila and David drove away from the excavation site, heading toward the nearest town. They hoped to find help, but as the miles passed, it became clear that there was no running from the curse. Lila could feel it tightening its grip on her with each passing hour, the darkness seeping deeper into her mind. At first, it was subtle. She would catch glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corner of her eye, only to turn and find nothing there. Objects in the car would shift or move on their own, as though unseen hands were manipulating them. David dismissed it as exhaustion, but Lila knew better. The curse was growing stronger, its hold on her tightening like a noose. By the time they reached the small, dusty town, Lila was barely holding herself together. Her arm had grown worse. What had once been dark veins creeping up her skin had now spread across her entire body like a web of corruption. The pain was constant, a dull, throbbing ache that never let her forget the curse that was consuming her. David, desperate to help, led her to a local doctor, hoping someone in the town might have knowledge of ancient artifacts or curses. But the doctor had no answers. He simply stared at Lila's arm with wide eyes, muttering something about a dark sickness, before shaking his head and retreating into silence. As they left the clinic, The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting the town in deep shadows. The streetlights flickered, casting long, eerie shapes across the ground. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows were watching her, creeping ever closer. "Lila, we need to get some rest," David said, his voice strained. "We'll figure this out in the morning." But Lila knew there would be no rest. The whispers had returned, louder now, filling her mind with ancient, incomprehensible words. She felt as though something was clawing at the inside of her skull, trying to break through. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure from the chamber. Its hollow eyes, its cold touch. It wanted her, and it was getting closer. They checked into a small, run-down motel at the edge of town. The walls were thin, and the air was heavy with the scent of dust and mildew. Lila sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the mirror on the opposite wall. Her reflection seemed wrong. The eyes staring back at her were hers, but there was something in them that wasn't. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can fight this." David turned from the window, his face lined with worry. "We'll figure it out. I'm going to find someone who knows about this. Maybe a historian, a professor. There has to be something in the artifact's history that can break the curse." Lila nodded, but deep down, she wasn't sure there was a way out. The curse had taken root inside her, and it was spreading. She could feel the malevolent presence growing stronger, feeding off her fear and despair. It was only a matter of time before it consumed her completely. That night, the nightmare truly began. Lila awoke in the middle of the night, her body drenched in cold sweat. The room was pitch black, but she could sense something moving in the shadows. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen, but the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind outside. And then, she heard it, the low, guttural growl from the chamber. The same sound that had reverberated through the ancient tomb now filled the small motel room, and Lila's blood ran cold. She sat up, her breath coming in short gasps. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, and the shadows seemed to be moving, shifting. Slowly, they began to take form. Indistinct figures with hollow eyes, just like the ones that had haunted her dreams. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. There was no response. She turned toward the bed next to hers, but David was gone. The sheets were tangled, as if he had left in a hurry. Panic surged through her chest. She climbed out of bed, her feet hitting the cold floor, and moved toward the door. But before she could reach it, something stopped her in her tracks. A figure stood in the corner of the room. At first, it was barely more than a shadow, but as her eyes adjusted, the figure became clearer. It was tall, cloaked in darkness, its face obscured by a hood. Lila's heart raced, the terror in her chest suffocating her. She recognized the figure. It was the same one from the chamber. The curse had found her again. "You cannot escape me," the figure hissed, its voice like nails scraping against her mind. "You are mine." Lila backed away, her mind spinning. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing as the darkness pressed in. The figure moved closer, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the blackness. Suddenly, the mirror on the wall shattered, the pieces flying across the room like shards of glass rain. Lila cried out, her hands covering her face. When she looked up again, the figure was gone, but the curse had left its mark. The mirror's broken shards lay scattered across the floor, reflecting fragments of her terrified face. In each piece, her eyes glowed faintly, just like the figure's. Desperate and shaking, Lila bolted from the room, her heart pounding in her ears. She ran through the darkened hallways of the motel, but no matter how far she went, the whispers followed her, growing louder and more insistent. They called her name, taunting her, reminding her that there was no escape. Suddenly, she heard footsteps behind her, quick, heavy footsteps. She spun around, her breath catching in her throat. It was David. He was pale, his face lined with terror, his eyes wide. "Lila, I was looking for you. Something's wrong." "I know," she whispered, her voice shaky. "It's here. The curse. It won't let me go." David glanced around, as though expecting the shadows to lunge at him. "We have to leave. Now." They rushed outside into the cold night air, but the darkness followed them. The town was eerily silent, the streets empty and bathed in pale moonlight. Shadows stretched across the pavement, twisting and shifting like living things. As they reached the car, Lila felt a sudden, sharp pain in her chest. She gasped, clutching her heart as her vision blurred. David grabbed her arm, his voice frantic, but she couldn't make out his words. The pain intensified, spreading through her entire body. It felt as though her very soul was being torn apart. The last thing she saw before collapsing was the faint glow of the cursed amulet, buried deep within her mind, pulsing with dark, ancient power. Then, everything went black. When Lila awoke, she was no longer in the motel parking lot. The cold, rough ground beneath her was unfamiliar, and the air around her was thick and heavy, filled with the stench of decay. Her body ached with every breath, and she struggled to sit up, her head pounding as though it might split open. As her vision slowly cleared, she realized she was back in the desert. But this wasn't the desert she had left. The landscape was twisted and warped, a desolate, lifeless expanse where the sky bled into the horizon in sickly shades of red and black. Jagged stone spires jutted out from the ground like the bones of some ancient beast, casting long, ominous shadows across the sand. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, constant hum, the same hum she had heard when she first touched the cursed amulet. Panic seized her chest. Where was David? She forced herself to stand, her legs trembling beneath her. The dark veins that had once only marked her arm now covered her entire body, and her skin burned where they ran, as if they were filled with liquid fire. Each pulse of her heart sent waves of pain through her, but she pressed forward, driven by a growing sense of urgency. There, ahead of her, she saw it. The figure. The same cloaked form that had haunted her nightmares. The same malevolent presence she had felt since the day she unearthed the artifact. It stood atop a stone platform, its hollow eyes gleaming beneath its hood, watching her. "You are awake," the figure said, its voice echoing across the empty wasteland. "At last you understand." Lila's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cursed landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, and the figure, whatever it was waiting for her, as though it had been expecting her all along. "What do you want from me?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fear and anger. "Why me?" The figure didn't move, but the air around it seemed to grow heavier, darker. "You were chosen, Lila. The moment you touched the amulet, you became the vessel. My power has been locked away for millennia, and now, through you, I am reborn." "No," she gasped, shaking her head. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." The figure's hollow eyes seemed to bore into her soul. "Your desires are irrelevant. The curse was always meant to be passed on. You are simply the latest in a long line of those who have tried and failed to escape it." Lila's knees buckled, and she fell to the ground, clutching her head as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Images flashed through her mind, visions of the ancient civilization that had created the amulet, a city now long forgotten, its people consumed by the darkness they had summoned. She saw the curse spreading like a plague, twisting and corrupting everything it touched, and at the center of it all was the figure standing before her. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "There has to be a way to stop this." The figure's laugh was low and hollow, like the sound of dry bones scraping together. "There is no stopping what has already begun. The curse is eternal, passed from one soul to the next. But you, Lila, you will not simply carry it. You will complete it." The ground beneath her shook violently, and Lila screamed as cracks spread across the desert, glowing with a deep, unnatural light. From the fissures rose the same shadowy figures she had seen in her visions, the cursed souls of those who had come before her, their hollow eyes fixed on her as they drifted closer. "No!" she shouted, stumbling to her feet. "I won't let you take me." But even as she spoke, she could feel the curse tightening around her like a vice. Her body was no longer her own. The dark veins pulsed and throbbed, wrapping tighter and tighter until it felt as though her skin would tear apart. The power of the curse was inside her now, coursing through her blood, and with each step she took, the presence of the figure grew stronger. Desperation clawed at her mind. There has to be a way out. And then, she remembered the amulet. The amulet was the source of the curse, the key to unlocking the figure's power. But perhaps it was also the key to defeating it. She looked up at the figure, her eyes blazing with defiance. If I'm the vessel, then I control the curse. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes narrowing. You control nothing. The curse owns you. Lila reached inside her jacket and pulled out the amulet, which still pulsed with that eerie, dark energy. The figure's gaze fixed on it, and for the first time, Lila saw something in those empty eyes, a flicker of hesitation. Then let's see what happens when I destroy it, she said through gritted teeth. The figure's voice was sharp, filled with sudden urgency. You cannot destroy what you do not understand. The curse. But Lila didn't wait for it to finish. With every ounce of strength she had left, she raised the amulet above her head and brought it crashing down against the stone beneath her. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, and for a split second, everything went still. Then, the amulet shattered. The force of the explosion knocked her back, sending her sprawling to the ground as the world around her erupted into chaos. The sky split open, and a deafening roar echoed across the desert as the shadows began to dissolve, their forms disintegrating into nothingness. The ground beneath her cracked and trembled, the cursed landscape crumbling away piece by piece. The figure screamed, its voice filled with fury and desperation, but its form was already fading, its power unraveling like threads of darkness torn apart by the light. Lila watched as it reached out toward her, its skeletal hand grasping at the air before it dissolved completely, leaving only silence in its wake. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the darkness lifted. The desert was gone, replaced by the familiar landscape of the excavation site. The sun was rising over the horizon, casting warm, golden light across the sand. Lila lay there, gasping for breath, her body trembling from the effort. The pain in her arm was gone. The dark veins that had covered her skin had vanished, leaving only faint scars where the curse had once been. She was free. David's voice broke through the silence. Lila, Lila, are you okay? She turned her head, and there he was, rushing toward her with a look of disbelief on his face. He knelt beside her, helping her sit up, his eyes scanning her as though making sure she was real. It's over, Lila whispered, her voice hoarse. The curse, it's gone. David nodded, relief flooding his expression. Thank God. I thought I'd lost you. But as Lila looked out across the desert, her eyes lingering on the ruins in the distance, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. The curse was gone, yes, but the shadows of the ancient past still lingered, hidden beneath the sand, waiting for the next unwitting soul to disturb them. For now, she had escaped. But some things were never truly buried. The curse had been broken for her. But curses, after all, are eternal.